Yeah, so times being what they are, and as all of us coming to grips with technology a bit more than we used to, I thought let's try and do something positive with it and bring together some storytellers who might not otherwise be in the same room at the same time at the moment, especially since the storytelling festivals weren't able to happen in real life this year. So I'm delighted to have with me in our virtual room Hugh Lupton from Norfolk in the east, Rebecca Smart from Somerset in the west. We've got Sally Pond Clayton down in London in the south, and we've got Emily Hennessy up north in Cumbria. So all four corners of the kingdom. And we are all storytellers who work mainly with traditional narratives, with stories that have been around for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. And we create performances out of these stories. We tell these stories in all kinds of different places, in theatres, in festivals, maybe in schools, in museums, round the campfire, and a whole host of other weird and wonderful places. And the conversation that I was wanting to have today about synchronicity in storytelling is probably going to mean slightly different things to different people. But I was thinking of those moments when maybe you're working on a story or sharing a story with an audience, and something happens where you are or among the people you're with that seems to uncannily echo something that's going on in the story at the time. And it's these moments where, well, I feel really conscious of how much bigger the story is than all of us. You start working with a story and it kind of starts working with you. So I'm going to hand over first to Rebecca Smart, who is going to be talking about her experience of working with a particular story. So as I said, Rebecca comes from Somerset and she works a lot with story and myth out of doors as a ritual, as a rite of passage. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, so I do a mix of working in the woods, in the land, for retreats, and I also perform. And I suppose the bit of synchronicity that I wanted to talk about was really linked to what you were saying, Katie, around the story being bigger than ourselves and the story working us. So when I prepare a story, and this was for a performance, when I prepare a story, I always walk it in the land. That's the way I work, and I know that will be really familiar to a lot of people watching this as storytellers. So there's a kind of conversation that happens between the story and the landscape around me, and the more than human world tends to have a real impact on the way the story happens, and it feels like a kind of unexpected weaving at times. There's lots of synchronous moments that happen, often very subtle, but I'm sharing a more definite moment with you. So I was working on The Handless Maiden, which is a story which is very initiatory. There's a moment of real severance and there's a descent. So it was the moment in the story of severance that I was really focused on when I was taking this walk in the woods. So just so for those of you who don't know the story, just in very brief, there's a father, a miller, who makes a bargain with the devil, the dark man of the woods. And in exchange for wealth, he agrees whatever's in the backyard of his house, which is, he thinks, just an apple tree. Just an apple tree. And actually it's his daughter is also there sweeping the ground. And so there's a moment in the story where the devil comes for her and she's made a chalk circle around her and he can't get near her. But ultimately, despite the fact she has these amazing tears that come of grief that protect her, ultimately the father is forced to get an axe and chop his daughter's hands off. It's a huge severance. And as I was walking with the story, I came to this clearing just at the moment where I was getting to the bit with the chalk circle. and a bird had been killed in that clearing, and there was just a circle of white feathers on the floor and a stump. And I stood in that circle. It felt like quite an act to stand in that place because the death had happened there. And it was very still in that clearing. And I really stood there and I felt into this feeling of the very vulnerable, sort of wild feminine, I suppose, the gentleness of that. And then suddenly, in the middle of this stillness, shot 12 deer just across the clearing, and they were running fast, and it was this incredible energy and quite close. And 12, I was just like, and I didn't count, I'm being a storyteller, it was roughly 12. Just extraordinary moment that kind of it just took my breath away, and I was really with the power of that, and carried on telling this story with that dark man of the woods just being propelled away from the chalk circle, being unable to get this woman with that kind of energy. And then I continued, and then round the moment where the father takes the axe and raises it, in the middle of the stillness of this clearing, just came this volley of shots. They were extremely loud. They felt very close. And it just shattered the clearing. And I just wept, just these tears just came. They weren't even, they weren't, I was just completely in that moment. There was this extraordinary moment of the tears, which are really key in the story. These tears that she weeps, that protect her, actually, that being open to that grief. And it was this very intense experience in the forest, which then, in terms of the performance, it wasn't that I was doing any of those things when I was on stage. It was that somehow the land had placed an experience into my body so that I was able to embody that in my telling of the story. It was like that all those synchronous moments had invited me deeper into the experience of what is it to lose something utterly? What is it to be devastatingly severed? What is it to step into death, into an initiatory journey? All of those really big questions, something in what happened in that clearing helped me connect more deeply with it. And I hope it just added a layer into my telling of that story when I pitch up wherever to tell it. That's my synchronous moment, Katie.
Rebecca, thank you. Thank you. You speak in a way that I'm sure many of us will recognise about walking a story in, and how the landscape influences the story, and how the story seems to creep out into the landscape around us. I was thinking of a time just last summer. I was with a group of teenagers up in Scotland. We were spending a week there, making a journey from the south of Loch Ericht right up to the north to Dalwhinnie. And when I got there and stood on the shore of the loch and saw these mountains coming down to the water's edge, I thought of a wonder tale that I'd worked with some years before. And it starts with a fisherman in a little boat in the middle of a great blue lake, where the mountains come down to the water's edge. And it just seemed that I'd just arrived in this place. And I was with these young people who, like the fisherman in the story, like the young king in the story, were just setting out on their journey through life, just kind of exploring who they were, going on this great adventure together. And so I decided to tell this story in little bits every night round our campfires as we made this journey. And for me, it was one of those times where just the place and the people and the story just all really seemed to come together. And as Rebecca was saying, when I've told that story since in a more sort of formal indoors space, like some part of me is still standing on the shores of the loch. So I'm going to hand over now to Sally Pom Clayton, who needs very little introduction to most people in the storytelling world. She's been working with story for most of her life. I first saw her performing when I was just 13, so a very long time ago. And she and Hugh Lupton and Beth Haggerty were performing as the Company of Storytellers. And they did so much in the 1980s to pioneer a revival of performance storytelling for adult audiences in this country. So I thought when I was putting this together, I was thinking, well, I must ask Pom. And then when I did, I found she was not only a great believer in synchronicity in storytelling, she'd actually written a chapter about it in a book, which I hadn't known about. So it's great that Pom's been able to be with us today. And the picture you're going to see in a moment to introduce her, it's a picture of her telling Rama and Sita, The Path of Flames, at the Theatre Royal in York back in 2005.
This is a really big subject, and I've got 3 stories to tell, 2 little ones and 1 bigger one. Synchronicity, when I'm telling a story, usually seems to happen when I'm making the story and developing it, or when I'm telling it for the first time or first few times. And I feel that it means that I'm in a flow and that the universe is listening and helping me make the story. And one of them happened in 1990, so 30 years ago, and I was making Solomon and Sheba, which I still perform, but it's had many, many incarnations. And it's about Adam and Eve and Lilith, who is Adam's first wife, and she is a demoness. And it was the first performance, and I said the name Lilith for the very first time in this black box theatre in North London. And as I said her name, there was a huge, deafening clap of thunder right overhead. And the audience gasped, and I was shocked. And I kind of paused for a moment. And then in the interval, everyone said to me, "Did you make that happen?" And then a few months later, I performed this show at Battersea Arts Centre for the Crick Crack Club. And a very good friend of mine was there, and she was on a date, like a first date, with a guy called Adam. I'd never met Adam, and I didn't really think that this was probably a good idea to come to this gig because it was very female. And actually this friend dressed up as Lilith. She knew Lilith. And I had got to this sentence, which was Adam fell in love. And I managed to say Adam fell when this Adam stood up in the middle of the dark audience and fell over. And my friend stood up and she mouthed to me, "It's Adam." And I stopped the performance, and Ben and some people from Battersea Arts Centre came, and they carried Adam out. And he went to the hospital and he was fine. And Adam did fall in love. And he did marry my friend dressed as Lilith. So the story was like a kind of massive vibration. That's how I feel it is. And it affected, well, his life. It really did. This has happened to me so many times that I really wish that I'd written down the many times that it's happened, because I've forgotten most of them. Often it involves the weather. But more recently, I was making the show that I was doing until lockdown, The Frog Princess Punked. And I did it in Exeter. Actually, that was the last show I did. It wasn't a very good show. We had many problems. But anyway, when I was writing that performance and I was at home and it was all whirling round my head, and I went into the garden and a frog jumped up onto my shoulder. It's never happened before. It's never happened since. But I felt that she blessed the performance. So there's this kind of flow, I feel, this correspondence between the inner and the outer, and the story and the universe, and the universe helping me make it when I'm in that flow. And when these things start happening, these correspondences, I think this is good. This is going to work. Anyway, why didn't I take heed from this and be wise and careful? But no, I was working on the Ramayana for the Unicorn Theatre with a band of Indian musicians from North India. This was in 2004. And I felt that I needed to see some of the places where the story existed. So I went to Sri Lanka. And on the plane, I divided the story up into sections of the amount of days that I would have there. And I thought I would meditate and think about one section for the whole day. And I would go through the story and this experience like that. And of course, Sri Lanka is a place where this story actually exists everywhere. But yeah, very soon what I was doing and the story started to collide. And at first it was nice, and I was riding an elephant and Sita was riding an elephant. And then Sita was getting married and I listened to some musicians playing bhajans of Sita and Rama, praise songs to them. And then Ravana appears in the story and I saw Ravana's waterfall, a massive waterfall. And then Ravana captures Sita. And I was on top of this rock, Sigiriya, which is a towering fortress built by a mad, crazed king who kept women up there as dancing girls who would throw themselves off the rock to certain death just to escape him. And I was on top of this rock and Sita had captured Rama and I was groped by a guide. And it was not a nice experience. And I felt that I'd met Ravana. And then I started to worry about all the days that were left and the rest of the story that was left and all the things to come, which was battles and death and war and grief and loss and fire. But I couldn't stop and I carried on. And I thought, what is going to manifest? And I went to get my blessing to tell the story from the Sita Nurelia temple where she's supposed to have been held prisoner. And I saw the black earth scorched by Hanuman's tail. And I saw this botanical mountain that Hanuman is supposed to have brought from the Himalayas. And it was getting closer to the war. And I thought, oh, I felt really worried, actually. And what is going to happen? And then the day of the war, and I bumped into this festival for Skanda, the god of war. This was not something I planned. I bumped into it. And at this festival, young men hang from hooks, piercing their flesh, in honor, in dedication, in ecstasy to Skanda. And so I got through the war and there was some demonic drumming and healing drumming. And then finally, Sita walks through the fire. And then that day I saw some people, dancers, dancing on hot coals. And I thought, phew, I've got through the story. That was a stupid idea. I really should be careful. And I got on the plane and I followed the trail of lights like Rama and Sita back home to South London. And my car was missing outside my house. And my front door was open just a little bit. It had been open a long time, actually. And the stairs leading up to my flat were just covered with papers and clothes. And my flat had been burgled. And everything of any value had been put into my car and driven away. And I felt that Ravana and the war had come and ravaged my house. And the Indian musicians, they felt the same. And they said to me, why did you go to Sri Lanka? Why did you go to Ravana's house? Of course he would come to your house. You should have gone to North India, to Rama's house, and then you would have been protected. But I couldn't feel that it was just an accident. I felt that the story had met me and I had met it, and somehow we'd merged in this horrible way. And it had warned me that a story is never just a story. It is part of a universe of correspondences, thoughts, dreams, desires that influence each other. And it had told me to take care.
Thank you, Pom. You've given us such riches there. Thank you. Wow, those are incredible stories. Really incredible. And anyone who wants to read more, as I said, Pom has written a chapter on this subject in a book called Story, the Heart of the Matter, which was edited by Maggie Butt. And you can also find her retelling of the Rama and Sita story that was so influenced by that journey she made in a beautiful illustrated book of the same name. I was thinking, particularly when you were talking about Adam's collapse, of something that happened to me a few years ago. Before I came to Devon, I was living in a little village in Buckinghamshire. And I've got an old friend there who has only ever encountered storytelling through me, through a couple of local performances that I did. And he is now really very wary of ever going to a storytelling event again, I think. The first one was not so bad. We were on the village green. There was a sort of lovely festival where all the families were camping around the edge of the green, and then we had a big brazier in the middle. And I was telling stories, and people were gathered around listening. And one of the stories I told was that little story about the fisherman and his wife, the fisherman who catches the magical fish and releases it, and it gives him a wish. And his wife, she wants more and more, always a bigger house, more power. And every time the fisherman goes back, the waves on the sea are a little rougher. And right at the end of the story, at the climax where he's asking for her to be the empress of the sun and the moon, there's this huge storm raging. And I was telling this story, and what had been a sort of pretty reasonable summer's evening, the clouds were looming heavier and heavier. And at the moment of the storm, the heavens opened, and most of the audience, quite understandably, ran for cover. But there were a few children who, by that point, they were so into the story that they just didn't seem to notice, or maybe they just thought it was all part of the story. And so they just sat there. So I thought, well, I've got to keep going. I finished the story with them, and by the end of it, we were completely drenched, but no harm done. And those children, some of them were children of my friend, who then a few years later was in the audience in the local church where I was doing a performance for adults. I was working with a cellist, and there was this big dramatic moment in the story where the serpent prince in human form is struck in the face with a golden twig, a magical branch, and he collapses to the ground and is transformed into a writhing serpent, a snake. And at this moment that we were telling this part of the story, a man in the front row just keeled over, just collapsed to the floor in front of us. And of course we stopped, and the paramedics came, and he was, thankfully, he was okay in the end. But my friend was in the audience again that night, and he was like, Katie, I don't think I can do this anymore. I don't know what's going to summon up next. This is too powerful. So I'm going to pass on now to Emily Hennessy, who has created some powerful, wonderful storytelling performances over the years. And she's taken them to festivals all around the world. And she's got a great tale to tell us about a time when she was in Zurich.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Katie, for those stories. And Pom, what an amazing story of your trip to Sri Lanka and the Ramayana. And wow, what an amazing journey to pass through the story like that. Incredible. Yeah, so I've got a little story I'd like to share with you about an experience of synchronicity that happened to me at the Zurich International Storytelling Festival. So I had, it started off with a stomach bug, actually, a really grim stomach bug. I'd arrived in Zurich the night before my gig, picked up a stomach bug on the way, spent the whole day in the hotel room and just thought, oh my God, I have to be better for this performance tonight. It was my only gig with the festival. And I was terrified that I might end up missing it. So I summoned all the powers that I could, and that evening got myself ready and went off to these beautiful botanical gardens in the middle of Zurich, and this amazing huge greenhouse overlooking the whole of the city, which was our performance space. So beautifully lit, lovely plants everywhere. And I spent a few minutes just before the gig outside, just getting a bit of fresh air. I was still feeling a bit wobbly. You know that feeling when you've had a stomach bug and you feel a bit lightheaded, and the whole world is a bit trippy. So everything was feeling a little bit surreal anyway. And I remember looking out over the city and seeing these huge rolling black clouds churning in the sky, and I felt my stomach churning in the same way. But there was no time to think about that. It was onto the stage, and off I went. And I was telling the Norse creation myth, in which Ymir, the first of the frost giants, is created, and could see these black clouds kind of rolling above us, above this glass greenhouse, and then in the story, Odin and his two brothers, these gods, they raise their swords up high. They decide that the first of the frost giants has to be killed, and they plunge their swords into his flesh. And the frost giant crashes to the ground. And just at that moment in the story, when Ymir crashed to the ground, fell down dead, there was this huge flash of lightning, this enormous explosion of thunder that seemed to shake every glass pane in the greenhouse. And it was just this extraordinary moment of the epic world of the story meeting the epic world of the heavens above us in our world, this amazing collision. And everybody just felt this moment, and sort of no one knew what to do, so just sort of burst into applause. And it felt like we were, applauding the heavens at that moment. It really felt like the gods were with us in that moment in the story. It was quite an epic moment. They did actually tell me afterwards that apparently there'd been a power cut that had affected half of all of the buildings in the whole of the city, but I refused to take any responsibility for that. So that was my story. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emily. Thank you. And that moment actually at the Zurich Festival, it has rather wonderfully been caught on camera, and it's really worth looking up. If you search for Magic Moment Storyteller on YouTube, it's just less than a minute, and the timing is extraordinary. And Emily's off-the-cuff response is totally brilliant. And it just reminded me actually how storytelling is such a improvisational art form. No two performances are ever the same in any case. And I think that really allows us as storytellers, if we are open to these moments of synchronicity, to really respond to them in the moment, and the audience feel very much sort of even more drawn into the performance and the story and the creation of the story between the teller and the audience and the world around us at that time. And I'm sure people at that festival are going to remember that performance for a very long time, and maybe the difficult journey home afterwards. And if I think back over my years of sitting in the audience, listening to tellers, there's just so many times when I've had that sort of shiver down my back as something has happened in the moment of the story. And I was thinking particularly of a moment a couple of years ago at the Oxford Storytelling Festival. I think actually many of us in the room today were at that festival and probably at that performance. It was in an outdoor amphitheatre in the evening, and Joe Blake was telling the Welsh myth of Blodeuwedd, about the woman who is made from flowers and ends up transformed into an owl. And it was a very sort of intense performance. And as she did it, the moon rose. And at the end, there was this owl hooting nearby, kind of calling through the darkness. And it was really, really unforgettable, particular telling of that story. So we're going to finish with turning to Hugh Lupton, who was another one of the company of storytellers who were so influential in my life and in many others. Hugh's had a long and brilliant career as a storyteller. He's done many collaborations with other storytellers, with musicians, solo shows. And maybe he's particularly well known for his use of poetry and language within his storytelling, really using it like a muscle to bring the stories alive. And he's also written a couple of adult novels, The Ballad of John Clare and The Assembly of the Severed Head. So over to you, Hugh.
It's been very interesting hearing these stories, and like Rebecca, I tend to work on stories when I'm outside and walking, and I've got this superstition that if at some point when I'm working on a story I see a wren, then it's a kind of blessing on the story, and I feel as though I'm ready to go out and bring it into the world. Also, I quite often find if I'm telling a kind of indigenous story, an animal, if there's an animal in the story, it will make an appearance as I'm working on the story. But the particular moment I wanted to talk about today is kind of different from the other stories we've heard. There's a story that was told by old Betsy White, who was one of the Scottish traveller tellers, she's long dead now, about a character called Jimmy, who hasn't got a story to tell. And he finds himself at a ceilidh, and the host invites him to tell a story, and he stands up, and as always, his head is completely blank. He's got no story, no song. And the host says, well, if you haven't got a story, you'll have to pay a forfeit, and sends him down to the edge of a lake where there's a little boat full of water, and he has to bail out the water as a forfeit. And Jimmy, the hero of the tale, bails out the water, and there's a little bit left, so he climbs into the boat to scrape out the last of it, and suddenly the boat shoots across the water. He cracks his head on the side of the boat, and when he comes round, he's become a woman. And the boat drifts, and he finds himself at the edge of a lake in a place he's never seen before. And there she is, Jimmy, the woman, now walking, and she meets someone who says hello, and Jimmy says hello. And the man says, well, my old granny lives half a mile up the road. Why don't you come along with me, and you can warm yourself up, and we'll make a pot of tea. And so Jimmy goes along, and they ask who she is and where she's come from, but because she's no good at stories, she can't really answer the question. And the weeks and the months pass, and this young man becomes more and more interested in Jimmy. One day asks Jimmy if she would consider marrying him, and Jimmy thinks, well, here I am and this is me, and well, why not? And so she agrees, and there's a wedding, and 3 sons are born, and 10 years pass. And then one time Jimmy is out with her husband and the 3 boys, and they're walking along the edge of the lake, and Jimmy sees the little boat, and she says, you sit down under that tree, I must have a quick look at that boat. And she climbs inside, and suddenly the boat shoots out across the water. She falls back, cracks her head, and when she comes to, there's Jimmy again, back as he was in the first place. And the boat drifts, and he comes to land, and he sees there's a hill. On top of the hill there's a barn, and he climbs up and goes inside, and the barn is full of people. He says, my husband, my boys, where are they? Where are they? And there's the host. And the host says, Jimmy, where have you been? What's the matter? And Jimmy says, I was married. I had 3 sons. What's happened to them? And the host says, Jimmy, you've only been gone 10 minutes. You better tell us your whole story. And so Jimmy tells the whole story from the beginning to the end. And the host says, Jimmy, that was the best story we've had all night. And from that day onwards, Jimmy always has a story to tell. Well, I was telling that story in Norwich Prison. And I introduced it. I mentioned old Betsy White. And I think I also invoked the old traveller tradition that when you're telling a story, the person you heard it from is standing behind you as you're speaking. And I said, you might catch a glimpse of old Betsy standing behind me as I'm telling this story. And I told the story of Jimmy. And I was getting to the end. And the thing about prison is that time goes into a strange warped form of itself. So rather like the other world in the traditional stories, a day can seem an eternity, or 10 years can seem like almost no time at all. It stretches itself and contracts itself. It's part of the prison experience. I've heard people talk about it quite a lot. So anyway, I told the story, and when I'd finished, I saw there was maybe 15 or 20 guys, and the back, one of them got up to his feet, and he was wearing a pair of old baggy jeans and a tracksuit top, a bit unshaven, and he came running towards me with tears streaming down his cheeks, arms stretched out, as though I was his lost husband from the other world. And he threw his arms around my neck and he said, Betsy was my auntie. Betsy White was my auntie.
So we've travelled today from the Somerset woods through the Scottish Highlands to the dusty back roads of Sri Lanka, back through a Zurich thunderstorm, and ending with this extraordinary moment in Norwich Prison. I'm sure anyone who's listening, who is a storyteller or who has listened to some storytelling, I'm sure you might well have a tale to share. We would love to hear it. And I'd really encourage you to maybe tell us about it in the comments box at the bottom of the YouTube page for this video. It would be great to keep on the conversation, to keep on sharing these moments of synchronicity. So thank you very much to everyone who's joined us, and to you listening at home. And Helen, thank you very much to Keywords for the opportunity to bring people together in this way and to share these moments.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you so much to our storytellers, Rebecca, Pom, Emily, Hugh, and Katie. It's been really, really fascinating and lovely. And there will be more storytelling at Keywords. Once we're able to be fully back on the quayside near next to Custom House, there will be storytelling happening. So do keep an eye on nextocustomhouse.org.uk.